My wife posted on Facebook, he thought he was so clever. Turns out, the only thing he's losing is me, and everything we built together. She had a glass of Shiraz in her hand. I could tell from the photo. That particular stemware, the tall ones she bought from a market in the Hunter Valley on our 20th anniversary. 43 people liked it. 14 left comments. Things like "finally" and "you deserve so much better" and "that man never appreciated you." What my wife didn't know, what none of those 43 people knew, was that I'd been sitting across from a solicitor in a quiet office in North Sydney for the better part of 18 months. While she was planning her exit, I was quietly making sure there was very little left to exit with. My name is Ray Whitmore. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years building a civil engineering consultancy in New South Wales. The kind of firm that doesn't advertise because it doesn't need to. My wife, Carolyn, was 49 when she filed. We'd been married 28 years. We have a son, Joel, who was 26 at the time and working as a quantity surveyor up in Brisbane. Carolyn had always been the visible one, the one who organized the neighborhood Christmas party, who knew every teacher's name at the school long after our son had left, who had opinions about things she'd read half of and spoke about them like she'd written the book herself. I was the one who fixed the gutters without being asked, the one who renewed the insurance policies before they lapsed, the one who, apparently, was furniture. The day it started was a Wednesday in March. I'd come home early from a site inspection near Gosford. The traffic on the M1 had been impossible, and I'd sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and my laptop to finish a report. Carolyn's iPad was on the table, open. She'd left it there when she went upstairs. I wasn't snooping. I was just moving it aside. But the screen was still lit, and I could see her messages. I should have looked away. I didn't. The conversation was with her friend Renata. I knew Renata. They'd met through a Pilates group 5 or 6 years back. A woman with a loud laugh and a louder opinion on everything. The messages were long. Too long for me to pretend I hadn't seen them. "He'll never fight for anything," Carolyn had written. "That's the thing about men like Ray. They're too proud to admit when something's over. I've spoken to Cheryl," she says, "after 28 years, I'm entitled to half of everything. Half the business, half the properties, half the super. She thinks I could walk away with close to $2 million. Renata had replied with a champagne emoji. "The fitness instructor?" Renata had asked. "Still going? His name is Blake," Carolyn wrote. And yes, he's the reason I remembered what it feels like to actually matter to someone. I closed the iPad, picked up my tea, drank it even though it had gone cold. Then I sat there for a long time looking at the eucalyptus tree in the back garden, the one I'd planted the year Joel was born. I'd planted it in a spot where the light was wrong for it, and for the first couple of years I thought it might not make it. But it did. It had roots deep enough by now that nothing short of a chainsaw was going to move it. I was thinking about that tree when I picked up my phone and called my old mate Phillip Saunders. Phillip and I had gone to university together in Newcastle. He'd switched from engineering to law halfway through his second year, which I'd always thought was a waste of a good mind for structures. But over the years, his particular career had proven useful in ways I hadn't anticipated. He'd set up his firm in North Sydney about 20 years ago, estates, trusts, asset protection, the kind of work that happens quietly and has enormous consequences. "Phil," I said when he picked up, "I need to ask you something." Hypothetically, he repeated. And I could hear him lean back in whatever expensive chair he was sitting in. Those always turn out to be the interesting ones. I told him everything. Not the emotional parts, not what it felt like to sit there with a cold cup of tea reading messages on someone else's screen. Just the facts. The business, the properties, the superannuation, what Carolyn had said about her solicitor friend's estimate. Philip listened without interrupting. The way he always had. The way that had made him very good at poker in our university days and presumably very effective in a courtroom. "Come in Thursday," he said when I finished. "Bring your financials." Philip's office was the kind of place that made you feel calmer just by walking into it. Heavy timber furniture, neutral colors, a view of the harbor that cost more per square meter than most people's homes. His assistant brought coffee without being asked, flat white, no sugar, as if she'd looked me up in advance, which she probably had. Right, Philip said, spreading my documents across his desk. Let me tell you what we're working with. The business Whitmore Civil Consulting had been running for 26 years. I was the sole director. We had 3 long-term employees and several subcontracting arrangements with firms across New South Wales and Queensland. Annual revenue sitting comfortably in the mid-6 figures. Carolyn had never been involved in the business. Not a single day. But under New South Wales law, 28 years of marriage meant the courts would consider it a marital asset. The rental property in Cessnock, Philip said, scanning the papers. Bought in your name before the marriage? 2 years before I met Carolyn. I'd saved for 4 years to buy it. A modest fibro place that had since tripled in value. Premarital asset, Philip said. Strong argument for exclusion if properly documented. Which it is. He flipped to another page. The warehouse in Maitland, purchased jointly in 2008. That one was going to be more complicated. And the super? I had 2 accounts. One through my employer arrangements from the early days of the business. One I'd established separately as a self-managed fund. Combined, they were sitting at just over $900,000. Here's the thing about self-managed super, Philip said, taking a careful sip of his coffee. When it's structured correctly, and the trustee arrangements are clear, a spouse's claim becomes significantly more limited, particularly when one party has never contributed a dollar to it. I leaned forward slightly. And is mine structured correctly? Philip smiled. The same smile he used to give at the poker table right before he laid down his hand. It is now a question of making sure the documentation reflects what's always been the case. Nothing new, nothing creative, just clarity. We met every fortnight for the next 16 months. To everyone else, to Carolyn, to Joel, to the neighbors who'd see me leaving the house on a Tuesday morning in a decent shirt, I was just going about my life. Coming home at reasonable hours, being civil at dinner, asking about her Pilates class with what I hoped was a convincing amount of ordinary interest. Philip was methodical about it. We didn't rush. We didn't overcorrect. The Cessnock property documentation was gathered and organized, the original contract, the savings records from before the marriage, the valuation history. The business underwent a structural review. Nothing disappeared. Nothing was hidden. What happened was a careful, legal process of making sure that what was mine was documented as mine, and what was ours was accurately characterized as ours. She's going to get a lawyer, Philip told me at one of our early meetings. And that lawyer is going to ask for everything. I know. The goal isn't to leave her with nothing. The goal is accuracy. I agreed with that. I didn't want to be vindictive. What I wanted was for the picture Carolyn had described to Renata, $2 million, half the business, half everything, to be replaced with an accurate picture. The one where the Cessnock house was mine before she was part of my life. The one where the self-managed super had been funded entirely by my working years. The one where the business was the product of 3 decades of my particular expertise, my relationships, my reputation. The warehouse in Maitland was the complicated one, and Philip and I had many conversations about it. Carolyn's name was on the title. We'd bought it as an investment. In the end, we agreed that it would remain on the table for division. That was fair. It was genuinely ours together. About 8 months before she filed, I had a phone call I hadn't expected. Joel rang on a Sunday afternoon while I was doing some work in the garden. He was visiting a mate in Canberra, and something in his voice was different. Cautious. Like he was trying to find the edge of something before stepping onto it. "Dad," he said. I need to tell you something. Mum called me last week. She was asking about your super, whether you'd ever talk to me about it. Which accounts you had. I didn't tell her anything because I don't know anything. But I thought you should know she was asking. I stopped what I was doing with the pruning shears. Thanks for telling me, mate. Is everything all right between you two? I looked at the eucalyptus tree. It had grown enormous by then. The kind of tree that changes the shape of the garden around it. Not really, I said. But it will be. I called Phillip the next morning. He wasn't surprised. He said it wasn't uncommon a spouse gathering intelligence before a filing, trying to construct a picture of assets to take to a solicitor. He recommended we move to formalize certain documentation more quickly than we'd planned. We did. 3 days before Carolyn filed, she and I were sitting in the kitchen after dinner. She'd been distant for months. The kind of distant that feels like someone has already left even though they're still standing in front of you, still clearing their plate from the table, still asking if you want more tea. There was a particular quality to the quiet in our house by then. Not peaceful, just empty. I've been thinking, she said, looking at the table rather than at me, that maybe we should talk about where things are going. All right, I said. I think we've been unhappy for a long time. I thought about what I'd read on that iPad screen 8 months earlier. I thought about Blake, the fitness instructor, whose name I'd looked up once and then deliberately not looked up again. I thought about the Shiraz stemware from the Hunter Valley. I think you're probably right about that, I said. She looked up then, clearly expecting an argument. I gave her nothing, just held her gaze until she looked back down at the table. So, perhaps we should speak to someone, she said. A solicitor. I think that would be wise, I said. She filed 3 days later. The Facebook post went up that same evening. I found out about it the following morning when Phillip texted me a screenshot. He'd been monitoring her public posts for months, on my instruction, not obsessively, just carefully. Evidence, he called it. Context, at the very least. How would you like to handle this? He texted. Calmly. I wrote back. Her solicitor, a woman named Harriet Blaine, who had a reputation in Sydney family law for being aggressive in ways she described as strategic, sent through the initial asset disclosure request 2 weeks after the filing. The list of what Carolyn was claiming was essentially everything. The business. Both superannuation accounts. The Maitland warehouse. A portion of the Cessnock rental on the grounds that marital funds had been used for improvements over the years, which was technically true. There had been some renovation work in 2015. Phillip read through the claim and set it on his desk without any visible reaction. The super argument won't hold, he said. The SMSF documentation is clear. She has no trustee interest and never did. Her contributions to it were zero. The actuarial evidence supports exclusion. The business? Complicated. Not impossible. He paused. She's claiming the goodwill value, your ongoing client relationships, your reputation in the industry. Her argument will be that she supported you during the building of it. She wasn't involved in the business for a single day. I know. But the counter-argument is about domestic contribution, keeping the household while you worked. That argument exists under Australian family law, and we have to address it honestly. He met my eye, which is why we haven't been trying to make the business invisible. We've been trying to make sure its valuation is accurate. The business valuation Phillip had commissioned showed a figure significantly lower than what Carolyn's solicitor had estimated, primarily because the business's ongoing value was almost entirely personal, my expertise, my industry relationships, my professional standing. Without me actively working in it, the business had limited transferable value. This was documented, expert-supported, and Phillip assured me, entirely defensible. What she's entitled to, Phillip said, is an accurate accounting. Not a dream. The mediation was held in a conference room in a law firm in the CBD, one of those glass and steel buildings where everything echoes slightly and the coffee comes in cups too small for the length of the conversation ahead. Carolyn arrived with Harriet Blaine and a second person I didn't recognize. Someone junior, who sat behind them and took notes. I arrived with Phillip and a folder. The mediator, a retired family court judge named Owen Barnett, had the particular quality of stillness that comes from having heard every version of this kind of story for 30 years. He didn't seem bored, exactly, but he had the look of someone who knew which way most of these things ended before the first page was turned. Harriet Blaine opened confidently. The marriage had lasted 28 years. Carolyn had made significant domestic and social contributions. The assets represented the joint effort of both parties. She was seeking 50% of the business, 50% of both superannuation accounts, and full equity of the Maitland warehouse on the grounds that Carolyn had contributed substantially to its management. Phillip let her finish completely before he said anything. "We're happy to discuss the warehouse," he said. "Both parties are on the title. That one can be resolved straightforwardly." He opened his folder. "The superannuation is a different matter. The self-managed superfund documentation shows that Mrs. Whitmore held no trustee interest at any point, made no contributions, and was expressly not included in the fund's trust deed. The fund was established 15 years before the marriage began to deteriorate and has operated independently throughout." Harriet Blaine made a note. "Our position is that super accumulated during the marriage. The fund predates the marriage by 8 years, Phillip said, quietly, and the trust deed is dated accordingly." The mediator looked over his glasses at Harriet Blaine. She adjusted her position in her chair. "The business valuation," Phillip continued, sliding copies across the table. "I'd ask you to review the expert assessment. The goodwill is personal, not structural. Mrs. Whitmore's solicitor has estimated the business at approximately $1.4 million. Our assessment, conducted by a certified business valuer, places the transferable commercial value at substantially less closer to the value of its plant, equipment, and current contracts. The personal goodwill, which represents the majority of the number her solicitor has used, dissipates on departure of the principal." Harriet Blaine flipped through the valuation report. I watched her face. She'd been confident when she arrived. She was less confident now. "And the Cessnock property," Phillip said, "purchased February 1991. I have the original contract. Savings records from 1988 to 1991, documenting the deposit accumulation. This property predates my client's marriage by 2 years and 2 months. It has never been refinanced against marital funds. The 2015 renovation was funded entirely from my client's consulting income, for which I have documentation." The room was quiet for a moment. "Miss Blaine," the mediator said, "I'd suggest a short recess." Carolyn and I didn't look at each other during the recess. I sat with Phillip and drank the inadequate coffee. Through the glass wall of the conference room, I could see Harriet Blaine in the corridor speaking to Carolyn in a low voice, using the kind of careful, measured gestures that solicitors use when they're recalibrating their clients' expectations. When we reconvened, Harriet's opening demands had changed considerably. They retained the claim on the Maitland warehouse, fair enough. I'd always accepted that one. The super claim was essentially withdrawn, replaced with a request for a contribution payment from marital assets to offset the difference, which Phillip had already anticipated and had a response to. The business claim had narrowed significantly, no longer seeking the personal goodwill, focusing instead on a lump sum to reflect Carolyn's indirect support during the years of growth. It took 3 more sessions. It wasn't fast. It wasn't comfortable. But by the time it concluded, the outcome looked nothing like the $2 million Carolyn had described to Renata in those messages I'd never been meant to see. She got the Maitland warehouse. We agreed she could buy out my interest at the current valuation. She received a payment from marital savings, to reflect her domestic contribution during the business years. She kept her car and her personal accounts. The Cessnock property stayed mine. The self-managed super stayed mine. Joel called me the evening after the final mediation session. He'd known things were resolved. I'd kept him loosely informed throughout without burdening him with detail. "You all right, Dad?" "Yeah, mate. I'm all right." "Did it go okay?" "It went fairly," I said. "Which is what I wanted." He was quiet for a moment. "Mum called me yesterday. She was upset." He paused. "I'm not choosing sides. I just wanted you to know she rang." "I know you're not choosing," I said. "And I'm not asking you to." That part, watching Joel navigate the space between his parents, was the hardest thing. Not the mediation, not the documentation, not the 18 months of quiet preparation. The hardest thing was knowing that regardless of what Carolyn had done or how carefully I'd protected myself, our son still had to figure out how to love both of us in a life where we were no longer a unit. That stayed with me for a long time. It's been 14 months now since the settlement was finalized. I still live in the house we shared for most of our marriage. We agreed I'd buy out Carolyn's share, and she took a flat in Manly that Renata had apparently helped her find. Joel drove down from Brisbane a few months ago, and we spent a long weekend driving around the Hunter Valley, eating well, talking about his work and mine, not talking about his mother except once, briefly, when he said he thought she seemed okay. And I said I was glad to hear it. I meant that. I'm not sure Carolyn ever believed I was capable of meaning it. But I did. Blake, the fitness instructor, lasted, from what I understand, through the kind of news that travels in circles, whether you want it to or not, about 4 months after the settlement. These things have a way of resolving themselves when the financial circumstances become clear. The Cessnock property is tenanted again after a gap between leases. The eucalyptus tree in the back garden got through another summer. The business has taken on a new graduate engineer, a young woman named Zoe from the University of Newcastle, which reminds me that things continue and grow even after significant upheaval. I'm not going to tell you that I feel victorious. Victory isn't really the right word for something like this. What I feel is accurate. Like the story I'm living now is the honest version, without the layer of performance that had been sitting over everything in the last years of the marriage. The pretending that things were fine, the looking away, the being furniture while someone else made plans in your own kitchen. There are a few things I understand now that I didn't fully understand before, and I want to say them plainly because I think they're worth saying. In Australia, family law is not designed to punish bad behavior. The courts are largely not interested in who cheated or who said what in a private message. What they are interested in is financial accuracy, what was contributed, when, by whom, and how it should be fairly divided. This means that if you have built something over a long period, and you have kept clear records of how you built it, the law can reflect that. It also means that inflated claims built on assumptions and estimates rather than documentation, will fall apart when they meet real evidence. Preparation is not deception. Getting your records in order, understanding your own assets, speaking to qualified legal advice early, none of that is underhand. It is sensible. The people who wait until papers are served before they speak to a solicitor are the people who negotiate from a weaker position than necessary. Silence can be a form of strategy. I don't mean dishonest silence. I mean the silence of a person who decides not to react to provocation, not to tip their hand, not to have the loud argument that might feel satisfying but ultimately removes the element of surprise you need. Carolyn expected a fight. She had prepared for a fight. What she got instead was documentation, which is a great deal more effective. And finally, because I think this matters, protecting your assets is not the same as being vindictive. Carolyn received a fair outcome. It wasn't the outcome she'd told Renata about over the phone, but fair and equal are two different things, and what the settlement reflected was accuracy rather than assumption. I could have been aggressive. I wasn't. I could have spent the mediation trying to leave her with nothing. I didn't. What I wanted was for what was mine to be recognized as mine, and for what was ours to be divided honestly. That's what happened. Joel came down again last month. We had a Sunday roast and watched the Wallabies have a difficult evening on television, which is a fairly reliable Australian tradition. He's talking about a promotion at his firm. He seems happy. He's dating someone he sounds cautious about in the way young people do when they don't want to jinx something. I told him once, towards the end of one of those long evenings, that the hardest thing in all of it wasn't losing the marriage. The hardest thing was realizing that I'd spent years letting the wrong things go unspoken. Not the finances, the other things. The conversations about what we actually wanted and who we were becoming. I'd been so busy keeping everything running that I'd stopped asking whether it was running in the right direction. He sat with that for a while. Then he said, "I think that's probably the most useful thing you've told me in a while, Dad." I told him I hoped he remembered it when it mattered. He said he would. And I believed him. I've thought a lot about what this whole thing actually cost me. Not in dollars, though. I could tell you that figure with reasonable precision, but in the quieter currency of years. The years I spent being the kind of man who assumed that doing the right thing, consistently and without fanfare, would be enough. The years I spent mistaking silence for contentment, in myself and in others. That's the part I sit with now. More than anything else, what happened with Carolyn didn't come from nowhere. I know that. Looking back with the honesty that only time and distance allow, I can see that we'd been moving in different directions for longer than either of us admitted. She wanted to be seen. I was focused on building. Neither of those things is a crime. But together, over long enough, they become a kind of slow erosion. The relationship became a structure we maintained from habit, rather than one we chose from feeling. And when people stop choosing each other, they start making other plans. What I can say plainly is this. The outcome of our settlement wasn't luck. It wasn't the result of some clever trick or a desire to punish her. It was the result of preparation, documentation, and the willingness to think clearly during a period when it would have been very easy to act purely on emotion. Phillip Saunders didn't save me because he was brilliant, though he is. He helped me because I gave him time, honesty about my situation, and the right records. The law works with evidence. It can't work with regret. There's something I've come to believe about how we carry ourselves through difficult periods, and it's simply this. The quality of your decisions in a crisis is almost entirely determined by the work you did before the crisis arrived. That's not dramatic. It's just true. The 18 months between the evening I moved that iPad aside and the day Carolyn filed were not wasted months. They were the months that made the difference between an accurate outcome and an unjust one. I'm not telling this story to encourage anyone to be cold or calculating in their marriage. I'm telling it because too many people, men and women both, wait until the papers are served before they understand what they actually own, what they've actually built, and what they're actually entitled to protect. That's not wisdom. That's just the uncomfortable truth about how much we prefer to believe things won't go wrong until they already have. Joel once said to me that the most useful thing I'd told him through all of it was that I'd stopped having the honest conversations too early. Not the legal ones, the real ones. About what we wanted, about who we were becoming. I think that was the actual lesson of this whole thing. And it's got nothing to do with assets or courts or solicitors. It's got to do with whether you're willing to be truthful with the person you're with, and with yourself before the silence turns into something neither of you can come back from. Act with integrity first. Build clearly. Keep your records. Speak the difficult things early, while there's still time for them to matter. And if the day comes where all of that still isn't enough, at least you'll be standing on solid ground when it does.